No one really wanted to license foundational core technology, from a two people and a dog startup out of Porto, Portugal. The lesson learned. But the progress is, let's go into one step up in the platform sort of value chain, and instead of selling the entire foundational stack, right, but selling the use case those people were really looking for.
Welcome to Unlocking Retail Media, the podcast where we explore the evolving world of retail media, from data strategy to monetization and everything in between. This is where we break down how retailers can build smarter, data-driven media networks by aligning with what brands truly need, from scalable ad solutions and meaningful metrics to cross-channel attribution and programmatic strategy. Welcome to Unlocking Retail Media. If you've been listening to this podcast, we spend a lot of time talking about where retail media is going. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. It's our first episode looking back at the history of Kevel and really the history of retail media. So instead of focusing on what's next, we're taking a step back to explore how Kevel became what it is today. And you can't really tell that story without today's guest. Paulo is the founder of ShiftForward, the company that Kevel acquired to power what is now our audience product. But long before that acquisition, Paulo was building audience and data infrastructure in Europe, solving problems that retail media networks are only now starting to fully appreciate. This conversation is about the power of first-party data, about building things from scratch, crossing borders, what it really looks like when two companies join forces, and how Portugal became one of the core engineering centers powering Kevel today. We'll talk about the founding story of ShiftForward and what became Velocity, what it was like navigating the acquisition, what changed after joining Kevel, what didn't, and how retail media looks different from a European lens. Paulo, it's great to have you on.
It's great to be here, James. Thank you for having the chat.
This is fun because Paulo and I talk all the time. We hang out in real life all the time, and so this is one of the first guests. I guess Sam is somebody else I talk to a lot. This is one of the first guests where we know each other really, really well. So this will be fun. But let's give people the kind of background. So when we announced the acquisition, where we acquired what was called Velocity, but when I said earlier, I said the company ShiftForward because it really started before Velocity. So maybe take us back in time and give us a little bit of the background of the ShiftForward Velocity kind of pre-Kevel days.
For sure. It's a great story. I started back in 2011, and this was on the back of a sort of career started in London, working in the advertising technology, marketing technology space, from big data companies to smaller startups, trying to run and create the new generation of advertising technologies. And with that, sort of knowledge, started to create relationships with European publishers and agencies, and really thinking through what are they going to be building next. And one thing I realized is that a lot of these technologies wanted to be, retailers, marketplaces, they wanted to be technology companies. They wanted to own the technology, not because of the technology's sake, but because it was really the way for them to secure their future, their business future, their data. This was before GDPR, but GDPR was looming, and all of that privacy sort of focused world was coming, and everyone was trying to build it. And so we started out by consulting with these companies, giving them the blueprint of what would be their foundational advertising technologies, event tracking, user segmentation, and all of that. And eventually thought we kind of need to build products, right? And so it's a journey of thinking, what do people need? Okay, 90% of the time they needed exactly the same piece of technology. So okay, let's start building that piece of technology and licensing it out. No one really wanted to license foundational core technology, from a two people and a dog startup out of Porto, Portugal. The lesson learned. But the progress is, let's go into one step up in the platform sort of value chain, and instead of selling the entire foundational stack, right, but selling the use case those people were really looking for. And one of them was first-party data management. So actually, that's where we went out to get the first round of VC funding, was really to launch what would be the first-party data technology. And I believe at that time, there was no other sort of equivalent. Everyone was doing data sharing, third-party DMPs, and very little sophistication when it comes to their own, ownership of technology. That's the initial stage of ShiftForward. And we thought, but we still wanted to have that bigger piece of the puzzle. So first party data was one thing, that owning technology for forecasting was also another thing. So it's like big piece of the puzzle. And it was interesting because even back then, I was looking at the other technology companies out there, and Adzerk, now Kevel, was one of them, following a similar sort of path. And in fact, I recommended Adzerk to some of the German, publishers looking for, proprietary technology to run themselves. And it was a similar pattern. I think we filled different boxes in the bigger, in the puzzle. But in the end, it was always been about letting the companies, letting the businesses have a big ownership of and the control of how data is processed, what data comes in, have full transparency of what's going on, right? No data sharing by default, that shouldn't be an option. And it really just progressed from there. And we eventually even went up one more level. Instead of just being first party data, went about what are people doing with first party data, right? And then it became, we're doing customer segments. That's to optimize on marketing. And that's what we started to do. So we turned the product into a first party data marketing solution so that with machine learning and AI to be able to do automated segmentation. So really lift the work out of the person behind the screen to do their job. Right. And I think that was about the same time. And we were on that journey. That he came knocking on the door asking about what were we doing. And yeah, that's part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, we first. I mean, I think we talked before this, but I think the memory I have of the first kind of real time we started talking a lot was around. We were really looking at how do we improve our forecasting. So our forecasting engine was it was fine back then. This is back in pre 2020. We had a forecasting engine, but it wasn't at the level we needed it to be, right? Like it wasn't taking the approach of really doing full like simulations and being able to do everything like frequency capping and user targeting and all the kind of really complex kind of targeting that we'd added. And so I was kind of just looking around and found this website that looked like an API for forecasting. And I was like, hey, this is actually pretty interesting. I think this is what we want to use. And I think I just reached out and like through the form or through the email or something like that.
It is.
And we like set up a call and we like had a call
That's right.
about how does like, hey, can we use your API? How does this work?
Yeah, it was pretty funny because I actually think the first time I saw that email come through, I kind of doubted that was a real legitimate, lead generated, request because we actually had reached out to Adzerk before, pitching, the forecasting as a solution, because that was one of the two pieces of the puzzle we had built, right? The forecasting engine and the first party data management system. And that was the beginning of that conversation. And I think we only focused on the forecast to begin with, right? For a good couple of years, we really just focused on how can we make Kevel's forecast better, right? And I think it was at the end of that project when we actually completed the handover, it was starting to run, and that he eventually turned around and said, "Well, what are you doing? What's the company doing? Well, what else is out there?" And like, oh, we haven't really been speaking about that. We're just so focused on fixing that problem and improving that solution that we didn't really, talk about, hey, what are we both doing here? And I think that was an interesting moment for us as well because throughout this journey, we sold Shift Forward to Velocity, hence the changing in the name. And it was the back of the recognition that Shift Forward as an original, company was really a technology-focused company. It really didn't have mature and sophisticated sales and marketing. And we really had two options out there, really, is it to sell or to reinvest and fundraise to go on that path. And so we found originally in Velocity a suitable acquirer. It just turned out that that business did not work out well. And within a few months, we had sort of rebooted to say Shift Forward version 2, which is essentially the same thing, but in the process, we actually got new investors and new backers to let us have that second stage. So that's when we actually took from the first foundational first party data infrastructure to the first party, customer data platform, DMP, whatever you want to call it. That was really about the targeting and ROI-led, performance-driven uses of the first-party data itself. Right? And that's where we first got our first real interesting customers in the e-commerce space. And we're at that moment a few years in, we're thinking, okay, what do we do now? Do we go through again the same exercise now that we found decent product market fit? Do we now do the next 10x sort of growth through funding, or do we, find someone else to go and join forces again? Because that was always on the table. And I think you just came knocking on the right moment. We were just thinking through, what are we doing here? And I remember you asking me about that, and I thought, I don't think it makes any sense because like you're doing ad serving like for tech, and you went, no, 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 hang on, that's not the future. That has been the trajectory we've been, but we actually are selling into and working on retailers and on-site and e-commerce, and it's all about powering that on-site marketing. And I'm like, oh, that was the first time sort of that dawned on me what retail media was. I don't even know if there was a name for it at the moment, but the idea of doing that on the e-commerce retailers on properties was like, that's the missing link, right? Because from a first party data perspective, you have it, but you have to use it to make, to generate revenue from it. And the retail media as a business model is exactly that, right? It's taking ownership of everything you have, not taking part of it, and but still really generating meaningful revenue, generating a better customer experience. But I just never thought about it. Like until you brought it out that you were actually starting that path, like, oh, okay, then maybe it makes sense for us to keep talking and I'll show you what we have.
Yeah. I remember that. I remember that conversation because I think I was like, hey, kind of like loosely opening the topic of like, hey, like
Yeah.
maybe it would make sense for us to kind of combine forces. And you were like, I don't know. And I was like, well, here, let me show you this deck. And I think I basically like just walked you through, or maybe it was a document I shared. I don't remember, but it was it was basically the pitch for like what became the retail media cloud, right? That was like, okay, like we have this infrastructure for ad serving and reporting. We're adding in, we've been working with you for the last year on this like forecasting infrastructure. And I'm like, but there's this missing piece of how do retailers get their first party data, get it segmented properly, get it into the system for targeting, whether that's connecting to their already existing CDP or that's collecting the data on their site or however we're getting that first party data. And then I think, yeah, you were like, oh, okay, yeah, this could make sense. And then, a bunch of messy acquisition stuff. And then we made it happen.
Absolutely, yeah. It was revelating for me because it wasn't obvious. Now I think it's pretty obvious that is the future and that is what one of the biggest revenue lines for some of the retailers and certainly marketplaces. But it wasn't very obvious back then that that was sort of a promising future. It was sort of a good bet, but an unknown bet at that time, I think. And I kind of saw what you're seeing because you were showing it to me. If I had discovered it on my own, I'm not sure I would have been as enticed into it as I was because you sort of show me that perspective, right? That was very important.
Yeah, and I think whenever when I think about acquisitions, it's like there has to be like multiple good reasons and like good things to come out of it. And so, I think one, obviously we've talked a little bit about like the forecasting engine that, we acquired as part of it and the team behind that. Like we now have rolled out forecasting across, most of our customers. They have, a great UI for seeing how do they book campaigns. Like it really, drives that ability to predictably sell campaigns. So that's one, like check mark, it's been successful. I think two, and let's talk a little bit more about this, is like is audience and the kind of first party data management system where I think it's even today there's a lot of retailers that maybe have a CDP, they have like customer data, but I think the piece they're missing is how do they activate that? How do they activate that quickly? I think one of the things that really opened my eyes when looking at how you all and now we all have designed and built audience is that if I go to a retailer site, I go to Walmart and I search for 70-inch TV, right? Then I get distracted and I click on another tab, right? Like how quickly does Walmart start targeting me as somebody who is looking to buy a 70-inch TV? I think what we saw with a lot of people's current kind of data warehouse driven infrastructure, it could be days at minimum hours,
Hours at
but
least,
that
yeah.
but that next impression, is the
That's
most
right.
valuable,
That's right.
right? It's like
Yeah.
I go click and I click on another category, or I click through and are now getting targeted with ads for looking to buy a 70-inch TV because I'm clearly an intender now to buy something that is a pretty sizable purchase, and we've seen that like a lot of the current infrastructure just doesn't support that.
Yeah, I think the crux of it is a lot of the processes the retailers have really come from their marketing activities. They don't come from a retail media activity. And so a lot because on paper they look very similar, right? I need to segment my customer base and I need to push it to a platform where it gets used. Um, but the devil is in the detail. Whereas in the traditional marketing sense, what's a couple of hours? I'm still going to reach out to these consumers for the next 30 days anyway. That won't make so much of a difference. But if you're monetizing your own inventory on a journey and the journey goes, for 30 minutes on the website or app, and I'm going from the first page views or, advertising exposures, and I now navigate through the page in the category catalog, and I'm now thinking through, I'm looking at prices. I may even stop and go on to the store and buy it in store. That journey is a few minutes to a few, maybe a day, but the opportunity for the ad to be exposed is in the first few seconds or minutes of that journey. You've got to be able to recognize the behavior, see the pattern, and be able to say, oh no, people in this category, they are likely to do X, Y, and Z, and surface the most relevant ads at that moment in time. So it's one of those situations where it directly translates into more sellable inventory, higher CPMs, right? It's not just I'm going to reach X more users. It's like you're going to get much higher yield simply because you're able to segment earlier in the journey. And that wasn't true before, right? If it was used for email marketing, okay, you're going to get email the day after. It doesn't make so much of a difference. And I think that's the big thing. Most people are obviously in their journey, in the maturity journey, reusing their existing flows and stack for retail media. But as you grow in your sophistication, you start to get specialized tools. I think the Kevel Audience offering is exactly that. It's like the specialized tool to either grab that information, make it seamlessly do data segmentation, but also reconcile offline and online, say, transactions, make sure that's all attributed so you can do online, views of ads and see what happens in the offline world and attach those conversions back to the online world. All of that is not a use case that existed before in just a pure marketing play.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think it even comes down to, I mean, something we've looked at a lot for e-commerce, where you're right on a marketing standpoint, it's probably not as important, but that merging of logged in, unlogged in users, I search for something, I see an ad, then I add it to my cart, then I log in, right? Like, are you correctly bridging those profiles for both attribution as profile and segmentation, and kind of a lot of those just really nitty gritty details that really matter in a retail media use case. That you're right, that if you're sending a text message the next day, it's doesn't really matter, right? Like they logged in, they bought something, you're gonna send them a follow-up text message, But when we're looking at attribution and
From a consumer experience perspective as well, right? We're talking about ads, but actually, when we talk about retail media, it's not so much an ad in the traditional sense, right? It's really how I'm experiencing the product catalog. It's a slightly different way of experiencing a product catalog. And so the right ad in this context, it's really about the right offer, the right product for me as a consumer. So if you don't recognize me in the journey early enough in what I'm attempting to do, then I'm just going to have a poorer experience. You're using data signals from yesterday or 5 days ago or a month ago that are no longer relevant in what I'm doing right now, right? And so this is, I think, going a little bit, foreseeing into the future. I think what ends up happening is this convergence and the importance of, the user experience and recognizing that the earlier you can get that information to be used and the merging of natural organic listing together with promoted listing for a single outcome, which is, a better consumer experience, which ultimately will lead to a higher, retail plus ad revenue, because that's the end game. It's to fulfill the higher revenue for regardless where it comes from, right? So almost coming maybe full circle. on the use of this information. It's really to the benefit of the consumer than the benefits the retailer or marketplace.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's jump back a little bit into uh, kind of the cultural changes and things like that, right? So thinking about, we've got this great tech, we kind of complete the acquisition, bring these two companies together. I think something you told me that I always loved was like, our kind of company values were always super aligned. Like it felt like even the first couple times I came over to Portugal and met with the team and talked to people, it was like it felt like there was a good cultural alignment between the companies.
Yeah, for sure. Can I tell the story? And do you remember that
Yeah, yeah.
story? We stole. I can say that now. We stole the original Adzerk sort of. I don't know if it was a code of conduct or the Ten Commandments, whatever it was, because back then it felt so much exactly how we were thinking. How people should be. We're all adults. We hire good people. We trust the people we hire. Therefore, we don't have to go around and micromanage or look everyone's shoulder. And obviously, written up in such a funny, irreverent way. We thought, why try to do this differently? We just copy pasted, changed a few words here and there. It was an internal document that we then created with it, and it lives for a very long time. And I think I shared it to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's a great example of like I think like I remember when you told me that I was like, oh, this is perfect. Like this is going to be a really natural transition for all the employees and everybody. And I think one of the things I'm very proud of is like I think, we're what are we 4 years in, five
Yep.
years in, and I think we've lost like one person like and you think about it over time, it's kind of like being able to retain one of the main reasons we always look when we do an acquisition is the people, and being able to basically retain effectively 100% of the people has been awesome. And that's I think speaks to that culture, but also speaks to the kind of team you built and the culture you built at the company.
I think it speaks to the culture you've built, to be honest, because one of the signals that we were looking for, because we had done that in the past, right? And it's like we kind of knew or thought we knew what we're looking for in joining forces with someone else, and the cultural alignment was one of the most important pieces because nothing works unless it works for people, and we kind of always thought that one way to build a good company is to really attract very highly talented people that like to work together. Because especially in the engineering front, which we're very strong in, we by hiring good engineering leadership, you attract other good engineers, you attract junior engineers, which would become great senior engineers. And so we were looking for at Adzerk, is that the sort of culture we have there? Is it a good chance that this sort of mentality is going to continue? And so I think the fact that there was such a small amount of attrition is exactly because that was the reality afterwards, right? With the code of conduct is a document, it's an interesting perspective, but then we have to see reality is just, it did match reality. That's why I think you have this. So it's when two very, very similar cultures sort of meet each other for sure.
Yeah. And I think like it's been really interesting to, I think when I first, when I first came over to meet you, that was my first time in Portugal. That was my first
Was
time in
it?
Porto.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. Like I mean, obviously we'd gone to Europe a lot. We had customers in like Amsterdam and London. We didn't have any customers in Portugal, but now, it's gone from where I think when I first came over there, it was, I don't know, 12, 14 people, something
Yep.
like that, to where now it's, I don't know, 35. Like
Yep.
it's a big team now in Porto. We've really made it kind of what probably our main engineering hub for the company.
In
So
the
I think that speaks a
central
lot to
office.
the, yeah, it speaks a lot to the talent, but also speaks a lot to like I think it's helped us really grow so much in Europe. I mean, some of our we have great customers now in Portugal and in Spain and in, of course, throughout the UK and Netherlands and Nordics. But really having a European engineering hub, I think has been great for us. But what's it felt like on your side?
It changed over time, right? When we just got acquired and we got together, it wasn't so much of a bigger presence, right? It was smaller, as you were saying. And it it's inevitable that it will feel a little bit like a satellite office, which it was, and it's fair to say that. Um, but I think the one thing I really recognize, like the visits that leadership has always made, and you made the point of coming over multiple times in the year, that really helps create that link and really makes people feel that they belong somewhere. And over time, not only because of the growth of the team, but also because of the growth that we had in the European space, it's inevitable that people feel, they're growing more locally, even if it's not just Portugal. Portugal is a small market, has some interesting customers, very sophisticated in what they're doing. But there's also other brand names that are more recognized in, multiple European countries. I think the team recognizes that, and I think feels motivated with that as well. And one thing leads to the other, right? Because I think European companies, and I think they recognize that there's a lot of US technology. There's not so much US technology with a strong European presence. And I think one thing I hear from our customers and prospects is that they like the fact that we have people very close by, even if they're not, even the engineering teams, even if they're not the teams they're going to deal with on an everyday basis, the fact that the product teams have a close relationship with engineering, and they're only one, step away to getting a fix done, right? They're in the same time zones. They're speaking similar languages sometimes. Like we have meetings in Spanish sometimes, which I don't really speak well, but at least, there's a lot of people that do, and, they have a good conversation. And I think that's something that it helps, I think, a lot. And it helps with that sense of belonging as well.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, it's tough to have to go to Porto multiple times a year. It's that no, it's a beautiful, beautiful city for those that don't know. It is, it's a joy to go there. So it's never a sacrifice to go to Porto. Most times of the year. Sometimes
Most of
December
the
is a little
time, yeah.
iffy, but yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a couple iffy months, but yeah, I think it's been, and obviously it's really helped us with, we have some great customers in Portugal, right? Like Sonai, who we talk about a lot. I think, pivoting this into a little bit broader topic of like European retail media, I think something I continue to be surprised by is really, even though it may be a smaller market, especially if we're sitting over here in the US and we think about the size of the market in Portugal versus like the US, technologically, a lot of the retailers I think are further along in Europe than larger retailers are here in the United States. And I think that's a really kind of interesting phenomenon. And I'm not sure if it's due to kind of their space in the market, right? Like Sonai being the number one in Portugal kind of demands that brand spend and presence and kind of importance compared to maybe a bigger grocer here in the US, but they're like seventh on the list in the US, right?
Yeah. I think that's part of the reason the fragmentation of the European market just tends to create those sort of situations where you may have, an international player dominating the market, but more often, at least number two will be a local player that is very, very strong in our market. And the only, way to win against any other competition is really to continue to be positioned as number one or number two and invest in technology, invest in their, innovation. And I think that's what we see in the Portuguese market. Like, personally with Sanai, we know sort of very well. I think that's that innovation, that wanting to be and continue to be number one is probably what drove them to have a sophisticated retail media program. Um, and there's then other types of companies in the local space where they're either like a true local player or they're part of a holding group, right? And so sometimes in those situations, you have the holding group in their original country being very innovative, but then the satellite countries where they also operate, they're not as sophisticated because they're either waiting or they're not having as much as attention as their core initial country. Whereas perhaps in the US, even though there's a state by state sort of situation, it's not as fragmented, right? When you roll out, you're gonna go, roll out across all the US market, where that's just not possible because language barriers, because of market, it's just a very different dynamic. I think that's probably the reason why we see this nascent, but then all of a sudden strong innovation in the smaller market that would normally justify that.
Yeah, I think the European holdco really international holdco is like alien to a lot of people in the United States. Not where like, obviously we have holdcos here, but I think the difference is that, we'll talk to somebody where they, they're a holding company and they might own, they own a grocery store, they own a convenience store, they own a newspaper and a mobile carrier and a satellite company or something. Or you'll have somebody who owns grocery chains in Portugal and owns grocery chains in Poland and in Brazil or something. And just these very like very different divergent companies, or or a home improvement store and a grocery store will be in the same holdco. Which has been at, for if you're used to operating in the U.S., like we really don't have that. We might have a number of banners. You might have like Safeway and Albertsons and and things like that, but it's rare to have just a totally different type of retailer in a totally different country, kind of under that same holdco.
I think it's because of the growth opportunity, right? I think in the US, in the same vertical, you can grow just by the scale of the market. Over here, you can try to grow that way, and certainly some companies obviously do. But the other way to grow is just to go into more verticals, and I think that happens more often because the individual markets are smaller.
Yeah,
Which,
yeah, that makes sense.
and from a retail media perspective, I don't think we see a lot of cross vertical utilization yet. But I think it's possibly one of the future pieces, and perhaps where you see some innovation out of Europe, where it's less likely in the US, where you're joining multiple verticals up because they belong to the same group, trying to innovate together and trying to do something special as a group. Because those groups, as you're saying, they don't exist elsewhere at the same scale as they do here.
So, and tying it back to kind of a larger trend, you kind of have a unique perspective, right? Like, as our VP of product, you're out there talking to European retailers, sometimes in Portuguese, you're talking to American retailers, you're talking to, South American retailers. How do you see, what are the big differences that you see when you're looking at like the retail media? Not like, we talked a little bit about that retail is different, but really when they think about the retail media programs, like what are the differences you see in these different markets?
I think the biggest obvious observation is just the scale, right? A medium size player in the US is probably larger than some of the largest in European space. There are some exceptions, and especially in the marketplace space, there's some very large ones. But there's that size, and I think the size component just creates a need for the technology to be thought and used in a slightly different way. So with a larger scale, you probably tend to do small optimizations of small improvements that, because of the scale, they have a big impact. Whereas if you're at a slightly smaller scale, you need to go for more, I'm not going to say dramatic, or more innovative, more impactful opportunities or designs or strategies, because the markets is a smaller. In order to get the same sort of impact, you just have to be, perhaps a little bit more adventurous. So we start to see, I think, some of that in, say, forecasting management, yield management. So those needs, for example, to really be optimizing towards the highest TCPM ever possible, that happens in the US market, but only when those companies have really reached such a high maturity that they're already sold out. And that's a lot more common in Europe because the market is smaller. And so they have to keep investing into these sort of, especially in around the AI, predicting what is the next best action, what is the best ad. And so we try to squeeze as much as possible out of the smaller amount of inventory and brand spend that they have access to. I think that's the shift. There's more abundance overall, I think, from a US market perspective. That's like the biggest thing that perhaps explain a lot of the differences in more detail. And perhaps because of that, this verticalized approach, like one thing we see is there's a lot of pure play verticals here, like just perfumeries. Like the only thing they sell is perfumes, or like beauty, but just in isolation. That's a challenge when you have that without the scale. And so looking to see how do we help those sort of organizations, because then it's even more important, because the number of advertisers are going to be, to do that, are smaller, so they will need a direct sales force, right? So whereas in the US, you go, no, it's just programmatic or programmatic direct is an option like over in Europe. Like there's no single market with enough scale for those sort of verticals to operate in. So we see a lot more demand for those sort of neat integrations over in the US, and in Europe is a lot more direct sold for those sort of companies. I think that's like the biggest consequence of this market segmentation. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how about, I mean, the other big difference, right, is GDPR, right? So going back
That
to
as
our
well.
like kind of first party data and we actually this came up in a couple episodes that we've been talking about people with like in store and where you were kind of the idea was that Europe kind of moved forward in store a lot faster because GDPR was kind of a constraint. But how do you think about like as a like on a retail media standpoint, like how how does GDPR play into it? Like how is that impacting the what we can do in Europe versus in the US?
I think it's for Kevel, and in fact for Shift Forward, that was sort of a great opportunity because I'm not going to say it was by design because GDPR didn't exist at that time, not in its full fledged, what it came to be, but this first party data approach, this data isolation by principle from the beginning, actually makes Kevel a very interesting opportunity to the retailers and marketplaces in Europe because it's one of the places it can be very sure without having to go through a lot of hops to ensure that their data is only used by them. Even our training models are only used with each individual customer, even by design. And so I think that it's almost like if anyone starts to talk to me about GDPR, we know we're in the right path. Because, okay, if you're concerned about privacy, we all of a sudden have a very good chance of being a good fit because we are that privacy centric. I think in the US, even though it's less of a problem, I think a lot of the big brand and retailers, perhaps not so much on the retail, but in terms of brands and brand spend, they still have that consciousness. So even though on the legislative side is not exactly the same thing, the consumer trust, the brand reputation, all of that is thinking in a GDPR-like manner. They do not want their data to be misused, even if certain things are more flexible in the US. They, because of GDPR, are influenced to not want to have those practices. So I think we kind of win by proxy there as well because of that need. But certainly, conversations start with privacy first in mind in Europe much sooner than the US still. But they both get there at some point because the brand's sort of demanding it now as well.
Yeah, and we kind of see like I feel like this is when I kind of feel like a European company these days. I think we actually have more people in Europe than we do in the United States. But I think that when you're working with a European company, GDPR is just like understood that it's going to be a part of the equation. And we always see friction with this when you look at like how Google operates and kind of some of the consent they require just to do first party ad serving and things like that are real barriers that probably wouldn't be the case, wouldn't be so wouldn't be the case if Google was more European and less American, right? Like if they were having to live the pain of that, they would probably look at that differently. So it's where I'm proud to be a largely European company these days. Um, awesome. So kind of wrapping this back up, going back to kind of the just the acquisition and kind of taking a second for any other founders who are listening who are thinking about going through an acquisition, like what would your advice be to another founder to kind of have a successful acquisition and post transition and kind of keep growing.
I think for me, it's about really think through what's the fit, right? What is first of all, is that acquisition the right thing, right? Like an exit to another company. Is that the right move? Or is it going on your own with a new investment round, with a new set of backers? Or um, the second is really the cultural fit. I think the cultural fit is the most, I guess, misvalues part of the equation. I think everyone goes for the number, what's in it for me. I think that's the obvious part, but like, is this sustainable in the future? Because if it is not, you're not going to be happy doing that. Your team is not going to be happy doing that. No matter how much was put on the table, you're not gonna be having all full potential because you're going to be leaving sooner rather than later. That was, I think, the most important piece. and think about the future for obviously then your investors. If you're selling into another company, more likely than not to sell with some stock parts of it. So the financial growth and success of the company you're being acquired by is very important for you as well as for your investors. And it is your fiduciary duty to make sure that your baby is in the right home. And I thought about that a lot, and I did think that Kevel did have that route, and I eventually saw that. It did get to, you did get to have the pitch, and I needed that pitch and really need to understand that was the future, because if he was just a plain old boring ad tech, like I wouldn't see that. And I didn't in the beginning, but like, no, okay, no, I see that. But it then it makes sense. And I think that's something you have to go. It's just not sell to the first highest bidder, because this is not going to give you the longest, even financial outcome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Paulo. And I'll put an offer out for our listeners. If you happen to be in Porto, I think if
Absolutely.
you reach out to Paulo, we will take you out for a nice super Bach or one of these great Portuguese wines that you can't even barely get outside the country. So
Deal.
if you're in the retail media space and in Porto, I think Paulo or some other folks there could take you out and show you a good time.
Absolutely. And thank you for inviting me and having me today. That was great. I'm a big fan of the podcast.
Awesome. Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you, James.
Thanks for tuning in to Unlocking Retail Media. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share this show with your network. We'll be back soon with more insights to help you navigate the future of retail media. See you next time.